Granted.
I move that so much
the Leader of the Opposition.
Sorry. I move that so much of standing and sessional orders be suspended as would prevent the Leader of the Opposition from moving the following motion forthwith. 1. That the House notes when the Prime Minister deposed the member for Warringah, he promised new economic leadership. The Prime Minister promised a significant tax reform agenda. The Turnbull government has said the entire reason for its tax reform agenda was to deliver personal income tax cuts for Australians. And 2 notes that in the chaotic 6 months since the Prime Minister deposed the member for Warringah, the Turnbull government has A. floated and then shelved plans for an increased GST, B. floated and then shelved plans for dealing with what the government described as excesses and negative gearing, C. backflipped on superannuation tax concessions, D. attacked Labor's responsible plan for tobacco excise but now plans to adopt some or all of it, and E. floated and then shelved personal income tax cuts for Australians, and 3 notes that the only policies that the government has kept on the table are extreme cuts, including from the 2014 budget, including plans for $100,000 degrees, cuts to family payments, cuts to pensions, cuts to Medicare and cuts to schools and hospitals, and 4 condemns the government and the Prime Minister for failing to meet their own tests, including A. failing to provide new economic leadership, B. failing to respect the intelligence of the Australian people, C. failing to deliver any tax reform, and D. failing to deliver a stable and competent government, but instead leading a government racked by dysfunction and chaos. The Prime Minister has given up governing. The Prime Minister and his new economic leadership are simply going down the drain. We can date the birth of new economic leadership under the Turnbull government, September the 14th, September 2015, and 6 months later we can date the death of new economic leadership, March the 16th, 2016. This government has given up governing. The reason why this resolution should be discussed in the parliament is Australians are aghast that after 6 months of the Turnbull promise, nothing has materialised. I believe that many Australians had a hope that politics could be better after the change from Mr Abbott to Mr Turnbull. We knew that the job might be harder over on this side, but we knew there was a chance to debate ideas including tax reform. 6 months later, massive disappointment is the overwhelming emotion of many Australians about the Turnbull government. The Prime Minister and the Treasurer have failed the tests they set themselves. It wasn't Labor who said to set the test of new economic leadership. It was Mr Turnbull. He justified rolling the member for Warringah on the basis of new economic leadership. And in that time we have seen the constant retreat backwards from tax reform. There was going to be a white paper on taxation. The Prime Minister said in Question Time today, "I'll tell you what's going on, people of Australia, in the due process, and it'll be at the budget." But that's not actually what they've said before today. Mr Turnbull over here thought it was easy being Prime Minister, roll Mr Abbott, and then his inevitable destiny awaited Australia. The problem is, in the meantime, that he's promised a white paper on taxation. He then promised a green paper on taxation. And then we were going to have the budget. Well, that's disappeared. Then what he promised was just a tax statement. He promised a tax statement and then a budget. And then he decided yesterday, in one of those Turnbullian sort of excesses where I'm not sure that his Treasurer was notified, but that's business as usual in the Turnbull government, he said, we'll skip the tax statement, I'll tell you at the budget. Then we had old Senator Fifield out there today, because it's hard to keep up with the lines of the day when they're the lines of the hour. He says, no, we might have a tax statement. And then today again, we asked the Prime Minister in a very straightforward fashion. It was a most polite inquiry for information. What is your tax policy? Yet again, what we've seen is the defining response of politics in this country in 2016. All the government could do, all the Prime Minister could do, was talk about us, because the opposition's put forward well-costed, well-funded, responsible plans for the future. What we've seen this government do, and why we must most certainly talk about this motion, is we've seen the government move away from dealing not only with tax reform but with housing affordability. This Prime Minister lets himself down He's not really Mr Abbott, and I'm not sure his heart is always in some of the scare campaigns of the more conservative elements of his party. I'm not sure, in fact, the Prime Minister's heart's in a lot of what he pretends to be his policy now, but that's a resolution for another day. What he won't do is deal with housing affordability. He said that our plan on negative gearing, which is not retrospective, which is aimed at encouraging new housing, which is aimed at helping first homeowners into the housing market, what he said is that our policy of providing government support for new housing and not existing housing, well, this is disastrous. Disastrous. You can just hear him, the fingers running across the grand piano and saying, well, this is terrible. The point that he doesn't, he's neglected to tell the Australian people, is that Liberal and Labor state and territory governments have already scrapped first home owner buyer schemes for existing houses, and they use them now for new housing. Now, of course, if Mr Turnbull was right, why didn't he say anything in the last 5 years when state and territory governments have been scrapping schemes and moving the priority to new housing? But of course I understand some of the problem Mr Turnbull has. He can't be captain, coach and play all 18 positions on a football field, can he? He's got to let guess who out of the box occasionally. I'm talking about poor old Treasurer Morrison. We talk about the Prime Minister shrinking into his job. You should see the Treasurer. You need a microscope to find that fellow these days. And the difficulty I feel for Mr Morrison in all of this is he said that his passion, it's such a strong word, it's Morrisonian in context. He has a passion for income tax cuts. The problem is he's had his passion cooled. But of course this poor old Treasurer, he must hate going to Cabinet these days. Has this Treasurer won a single economic argument with Barnaby Joyce since he got there? Now, I understand it must be very embarrassing to lose arguments to Barnaby Joyce.
The Leader of the Opposition will refer to members by their correct titles.
And what we've also seen with this loss of this new economic leadership is we've seen the Treasurer. He was going to look at the GST, it's just shelved. It's not dead, buried and cremated, but it's certainly shelved for the time being. I'm just wondering with this Treasurer if it's possible for Mr Turnbull to sub in a new Treasurer. Goodness knows, Mr Porter and there's others who are willing to do the job for Mr Morrison. And to be fair, let us not forget Well, what I'm curious about is, has the Treasurer been down to see the Foreign Minister to see if Washington Post's available? Oh no, that's gone. Maybe something more low profile like New Zealand. He can talk to his old mate Clay and get some more anecdotes for the next press club speech. The truth of the matter is, though, that in 2016 politics is changing, but it's not changing in the way that Mr Turnbull promised. He is running a negative approach and a small target approach, and the Mr Turnbull, the insurgent, radical reformer of courage who many Australians liked before he became leader, that personality is gone, and his real persona has emerged as Prime Minister of Australia. He's nothing but a paid advocate of the Liberal Party, co-joined with the erratic leadership of the National Party, and Australia is the worst. The reason why we're not getting tax reform in this country is Mr Turnbull believes in nothing else other than himself. And that's a very confident set of beliefs, so I understand. Everything he said that he believed in before he became Prime Minister, tax reform, climate change, the CSIRO, even marriage equality, all of it's been dropped. The only thing agile about this Prime Minister are not his tax reforms, it's his convictions. This man puts the vein into weather vane. He is the ultimate hollow man of Australian politics. Let me say this to the Prime Minister on behalf of all Australians. There is nothing honest about not being upfront with your taxation plans for Australia. You've had 6 months to deliver an outline of taxation reform in this country, and all you've done is walk away from the excesses and negative gearing, which you acknowledge exist. All you've done is reverse the position on superannuation tax concessions, but you are still persisting, having boxed yourself in by perhaps talking too much and doing too little. You've boxed yourself into the 2014 budget. And I can promise you this, just like we promised Mr Abbott with the 2014 budget. We will fight your cuts to hospitals. We will fight your cuts to schools. There is nothing exciting about making cancer patients and people with chronic disease pay more to go and get their pathology and diagnostic imaging tests. This government needs to stand up and start fighting for the Australian economy and start fighting for Australian jobs. We see nothing exciting about shipping 3,000 shipbuilding jobs to Spanish ports, not Australian shipfields. And what we will do, and why this resolution should be debated, is because taxation reform needs an honest debate and it needs to be upfront with the Australian people, just like Labor.
Is